So this is an event on Pope Francis and climate change. It's sponsored by the Religions and Public Life Initiative in the Keenan Institute for Ethics and the Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions. It came out of a conversation a group of faculty had a month or two ago, which was really started in the Nicholas Institute and migrated over into Religions and Public Life and started to include other faculty about the fact that Pope Francis had dropped this encyclical in the middle of the world, and everybody was reading it, including people who don't make it a habit of reading papal encyclicals. And so there was quite a diverse group of folks gathered around the table wondering what to do with this, and we thought, well, we should continue the conversation. So this is part of continuing that conversation. Before I forget, we'll go for until we have room or time till 6:30, so we can go that long. Afterwards, the Divinity School student group Creation Matters has generously helped sponsor the event by providing monates and coffee outside. So if you want to hang around past 6:30, please help yourself to monates and coffee, not now, but after. And thank you to Creation Matters. Do you want to wave those of you who are with Creation Matters? Thank you very much. And then just to cue it up, the next step in this conversation is a event on November 3rd that'll take place in the Fleischman Commons at Sanford School. That event is Pope Francis in America, parenthetically Underworld, and it's going to be a moderated conversation between Michael Gerson, who's columnist for the Washington Post, and Helen Alvarez, who's done a lot of work on Pope Francis and is a law professor at George Mason University. And they're going to have he's an evangelical Christian, she's a Catholic, and they're going to have a conversation about the significance of Pope Francis on November 3rd at 6 p.m. in the Sanford School. So I invite you to that. I think those are the housekeeping things. Brian's going to introduce the panelists, but Brian Murray himself is the director of and the environmental policy program, environmental economics program in the Nicholas Institute. Works a lot on issues of economics and climate change policy, including matters around cap and trade. And he has generously agreed to moderate this panel, which he can now introduce to you, and he can tell you what the program is from there.
Thanks very much, David. And I want to thank the partnership with the Keenan Institute for Ethics for all you did in terms of hosting this event. I want to thank you, David, in particular. Jonas Monis, Jonas, if you'll raise your hand and take a little bit of credit for working with David on this idea and really sort of seizing upon the notion that this would be a right topic to talk about. Dude, I want to thank all of you for coming out in the evening. For joining us, which for what I think will be an interesting and spirited discussion. Fortunately, we have a great panel. We didn't have to leave Duke in order to get a great panel for this event. And I'm going to introduce each of them, and then I'm going to try to set the table a little bit after that, and then turn to the experts. Immediately to my left, we have. Oh no, we're not immediately. No, I thought we were going to. Anyway, at the far end of the table, I didn't even look that closely. I've got to go anywhere I'm here. We have Fritz Mayer. Fritz is professor of public policy, political science, and environment at the Sanford School of Public Policy. Fritz is he's an expert who conducts research on globalization and its effects, with a particular emphasis on the labor and environmental impacts of economic integration. He's also done some really interesting work on sort of the narrative of climate change, and I'm sure he'll touch upon that. Well, Emily, she should be clear which one she is. Emily Pechar is a PhD candidate in the University Program in Environmental Policy, the UPEP program here out of the Nicholas School of the Environment. Her research focuses on climate change policy making and psychological reactions to climate change. She's also been an active participant for the last 3 years, or this will be year 3, I think, in the Conference of Parties, the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, global meetings that are held every year and will be held in Paris this year. We'll talk about that. And then immediately to my left, no, I'm sorry, 2 down, is Dirk Philipsen, Senior Fellow at the Keenan Institute for Ethics and a Duke Arts and Sciences Center Research Scholar. He works and teaches in an area focused on sustainability and the history of capitalism, most recently on GDP as a dominant measure of success in the U.S. and international economic affairs. The encyclical speaks to so many of those issues. I can't wait to hear what Dirk has to say. Immediately to my left is Paul Griffiths. He's the Warren Professor of Catholic Theology at the Duke Divinity School. His research includes post-1950 Catholic philosophical theology and the philosophical and political questions arising from religious diversity. And being a post-1950 Catholic, I can't wait to hear what you have to say as well. I do want to set the table briefly and then turn things over to the panel. And what I want to do is I want to give for those of you who either aren't Catholic or haven't really studied this issue very well, or you're Catholic and haven't studied this issue very well, what an encyclical is, what this particular encyclical, Laudato Si, that's working my old Latin, what it covers, and place it in the context of Pope Francis's teachings and in contemporary climate policy. So first, what is a papal encyclical? It's literally a circulating letter from the Pope. And historically, it's been a letter to the bishops to communicate doctrine of the church that they are to communicate to their flocks. In more recent times, encyclicals have been directed at broader audiences than just the bishops, and broader audiences than just the Catholic Church. Laudato Si, which literally means praise be to you, was addressed to all men, sorry Emily, of goodwill, but I think the Pope means all men and women and all humanity who are concerned about these issues. It's the same terminology that was used in the encyclical Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, that was issued 52 years ago. And that was sort of the beginning of the use of that terminology. I think it's fair to say that in the past, papal opinions have had policy impact. And I think it's fair to say that the Pope is hoping that this one will as well. In particular, Pope John Paul II, a lot of what he was focused on was sort of anti-communism, given where he came from, and about and sort of trying to encourage the end of the Cold War. And I suspect Paul will have some insights on this. And then Pope Francis used his power, if you will, to help bridge the gap between the U.S. and Cuba. I mean, he was sort of a quiet intermediary in that, and as you know, our relations with Cuba have thawed in the last year, and he's played a role in that. So Laudato Si continues the Pope's strong and perhaps central message on the plight of the world's poor. And I think it's interesting. I think this relates to a certain geography of the papacy, I'll call it. And John Paul II, being from Poland, was greatly influenced by his surroundings on addressing oppressive political regimes. And I think it really sort of drove his own efforts and even some of his doctrine. Pope Francis, whose name of birth was Jorge Mario Bergoglio, and he was a one-time nightclub bouncer, is the first pope from the developing world. I think many know that. And for most of his life, he had firsthand exposure to the plight of the poor. He wasn't, by himself particularly, came up in the poorest of circumstances, but he certainly spent a lot of his priesthood and a lot of his sort of more prayerful moments, including moments in solitude in the village of Cordova, sort of not just observing but participating in the life of the poor. Argentina is a place of great economic extremes. He witnessed firsthand the dirty war in Argentina between 1976 and 83, where as many as 30,000 Argentines were slain or just simply disappeared. So it's no surprise that it's consistent with, and he's a member of the Jesuit order, and their motto is to be a man for others. And I think what he did is he is trying to extemporate that motto in terms of his being an advocate for the poor. In the encyclical, he emphasizes how environmental degradation in general and climate change in particular will be felt and is being felt disproportionately by the poor, and that I think really sort of drives many of his central message. As far as the timing goes, so the timing of the encyclical was then followed by the Pope's first visit ever to the U.S., not just as Pope, but or his first visit to the U.S. And as we know, it was met with great fanfare and great interest. I want to thank Justine Hudeman, my research associate, who I don't know how she acquired this, but this is a Pope bobblehead that somebody in her family got probably from the Washington visit of the Pope. So we know he's a rock star in many ways, and we have evidence to prove it. And then, of course, there's the UN Climate Summit this December in Paris that I referenced earlier, where basically all the countries in the world, 190 plus countries, are going to be seeking to develop a firm agreement moving forward in terms of both the mitigation of climate change, meaning the efforts to reduce emissions, and then how to adapt and how we're going to pay for it. And a lot of that is going to involve commitments by developed countries like the US and Europe to make financial commitments to developing countries to help move them on a lower carbon path, but also in some senses to help them adapt to the climate change that is going to occur and possibly to compensate them for previous damages. So in a moment, I'm going to turn to the panel and ask each of you to discuss the one element of the encyclical that rose above all and how this may tie to your scholarship experience or worldview. I'll start with an example for me and then turn it to you. So there's one excerpt in particular, and I'm not asking you to necessarily quote from memory, but I happen to have this written down on a piece of paper. So, and this excerpt comes from article 195 of the encyclical. It says, "Only when the economic and social costs of using up shared environmental resources are recognized with transparency and fully borne by those who incur them, not by other peoples or future generations, can these actions be considered ethical." And so maybe it's not surprising that the Economist picked out something there that talked about social costs, but anyway, that is what drew me. And you know, climate change has been described as the world's largest ever market failure. And what that means is that the markets are efficient at delivering some things, but one of the things that markets often deliver are pollution. In other words, the production and consumption processes that we use to produce things like electric power and transportation fuels. We pay the coal company to extract the coal, put it on a train, bring it to a power plant, and then the power company, we pay them to burn it and deliver electricity to our lives. But what we do not pay for is the damage that causes to the environment. We do not pay for the carbon dioxide emissions that go into the atmosphere and contribute to the climate change problem. And so we at the Nicholas Institute and a lot of other people across Duke and at other universities really focus our efforts on ways to fix this problem. Whether it's designing some sort of policy fix to limit these emissions and to put a price on them so that the polluter pays, and that investors have strong investments to incentives to invest in lower carbon, less polluting technology, and consumers have incentives to pay as they pay the full price of pollution to switch their consumption to lower or non-polluting goods. So that's me setting the table. And now I do want to ask each of you, again, we can go in the order that you're actually sitting next to me, if you want to sort of reflect upon which part of the encyclical speaks particularly to you in your work and provide some examples for the audience. Would be great.
So shall I start?
You should.
Could you pass the Pope along?
Okay. The Pope does not have a microphone.
No, it's kind of iconic.
Okay.
Now we're notice we should occasionally. I read this encyclical in June when it came out, and was impressed by the flood of coverage that it almost immediately provoked in every kind of media. Much of that coverage had something of the flavor of Samuel Johnson's comment on dogs walking on their hind legs. That's to say, it is not done well, but one is surprised to see it done at all. And a good deal of the comment on the particular policy recommendations, and indeed some of his analysis of the science with respect to climate change had exactly that flavor. It was really surprising to see a Pope doing this, and we're really pleased, but of course it's not done all that well, and we could tell him how to do it better. So much of the commentary was immediately focused upon a very low level of specificity, particular policy recommendations, particular elements of the analysis, and so forth. The part of the encyclical that I want to pick out, the part that I think is often missed in thinking about it, is that it's not really an encyclical about climate change or ecology even at all, or not much. That's not to say there isn't stuff about those things in there, of course there is, but fundamentally, essentially, at root and at heart, you might say, what this is, what Laudato Si is an essay in theological anthropology. That is to say, it's an essay about what it's like to be human. And it's only if one keeps that frame in mind that most of the particulars make any sense. I want to pick out a couple of examples of what I mean. 3 or 4 times in the encyclical, there's a repetition of the phrase, everything is connected. And that's a key phrase in the encyclical. He's not writing only about the damage we have brought about to the ecology in which we live. He's not writing only about the disruptions to climate that are at least in part produced by human agency. He's rather locating those within a fundamental anthropology, an anthropology that understands what it is to be human, essentially on a technocratic model. So the idea is that all of these things, the damage we produce to the environment, the oppression that the rich place upon the poor, our tendency to use up, devastate, and throw away at every level, all these things are manifestations of the same root cause, he often says, and it is the idea that human persons are understood dominantly, certainly in the developed nations of the West, on a technocratic model, which means that they're understood as agents whose principal purpose is to understand and master what is around them, to control it, to act as a kind of dominus or lord to it. That's the technocratic model. And all of these things flow from that. So the central thrust of the encyclical is to explain what that anthropology is and then to counter it with a different one. To counter it with an anthropology which understands what it is to be human, principally in terms first of gift and giftedness. That's a term that comes up about a dozen times in the encyclical. So what it is to be human on this view is to receive the gift of oneself and the gift of a place in which one finds oneself. And ideally then to respond to giftedness precisely by renouncing the attempt to master as a technocrat would. That's then the anthropology that he advocates that replaces the one that he offers a critique of. So that's the thing that impresses me most about the encyclical. It's in a long line of Catholic theological thought about what it is to be human. And it's an application of this anthropology to a particular set of questions. But it's an application that itself renounces simple technological fixes to the problems that we find ourselves in. So I'll conclude my brief remarks by noting an example of that. And this is in section 171 of the encyclical. In the policy recommendation parts, one of the things that happens half a dozen times is that Francis offers a criticism of particular policy recommendations because they don't address the fundamental anthropological concern. And here's a really good example of this. So this is 171, and he's writing here about carbon credits. So he writes this: the strategy of buying and selling carbon credits can lead to a new form of speculation, which would not help reduce the emission of polluting gases worldwide. This system seems to provide a quick and easy solution under the guise of a certain commitment to the environment, but in no way does it allow for the radical change which present circumstances require. Rather, it may simply become a ploy which permits maintaining the excessive consumption of some countries and sectors. Now, the interest of this to me is not so much about the rights and wrongs of carbon credits, cap and trade, carbon taxes, and all that fascinating and important though those topics are. It's rather the ground on which the Pope here rejects carbon credits. It's not principally, I think, a calculation of the likely outcomes. It's rather that the fix itself is a manifestation of the anthropology that brought about the problem, and that following fixes of that sort, in fact, won't fix it, because these fixes are manifestations of the problem that is in fact at the root cause. So that's an interesting moment in these, but there are other ones like it, which it would be able to address, I think. So what I'd like to recommend is that we keep in mind this fundamental anthropological frame. Another thing I will note, just because I liked it, occasionally bad-tempered, Pope Francis in this, I think. And there's a couple of side swipes about air conditioning, which I really like. It's one of my own pet hatreds in life. So if we take these side swipes seriously, we would all just stop it, I think, using air conditioning. I mean, and it's worth thinking about what that would mean, especially in Durham, North Carolina.
Thanks so much, Paul. I have a feeling there will be people in the audience who will want to talk about Article 171.
People on the panel.
Emily, you have the vote.
I have the vote. Okay, so there's a lot of ways that you can look at this encyclical. You can look at it from a lot of different perspectives. And as the token international climate change policy person on this panel, I'm going to look at it from that perspective. And from that perspective, what really stuck out to me was Pope Francis's really a strong focus on the disadvantaged positions of poor countries in addressing climate change. This isn't really surprising given what we know about Pope Francis, given that we know that he is the first pope in the developing country, that many of his other statements have been in support of the poor and the disadvantaged. But I think that it's really interesting that he frames his encyclical so much on that stance, because it has some really interesting implications for climate change policy, especially at the international level. Most interestingly, I think, is that a lot of scholars have seen a bit of a change in the differences between rich and poor countries in the international climate change negotiations over the past 20 years. We started out in 1992 with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which really set the standards for how we're going to talk about climate change and how we're going to do these negotiations. And in the framework, it was very clear differentiation between developed countries and developing countries. So rich countries, poor countries, north countries, south countries. And the distinction was very clear, and the responsibilities of these two countries in terms of how we're going to clean up our emissions was very different. However, we followed with the Kyoto Protocol, we followed that differentiation, and it didn't work out so well. Specifically in the United States, the Senate made a resolution in 1997 saying that the U.S. will not sign on to any international climate change agreement that does not have emissions reduction requirements for all countries. So that's basically pushing back on this idea, as it's called in the Framework Convention, of common but differentiated responsibilities between rich and poor countries. Over the past probably about 10 years or so, I think, and several scholars have noted that we've seen a shift in reducing this big distance between rich and poor countries in the climate change negotiation. In order, in part, to get countries like the United States to the negotiating table, but also as a reflection of changes within these countries. So we've seen countries like China, India, Brazil really develop more, and a lot of times we may consider them more on the side of developed countries than developing countries. Lots of debate around that, but they're in a different place than they were in 1992. The climate agreement that will hopefully be negotiated in Paris this year has an expectation that all countries, rich and poor, make submissions documenting their contributions to reducing emissions that result in climate change. So that's a big difference than what we saw in, for example, the Kyoto Protocol, which was our first international treaty attempt to try to fight climate change, which only had emissions reduction requirements for developed countries, rich countries. So that's a lot of background to say that in some way we have been moving towards reducing the gaps between how we think about rich and poor countries in the climate change negotiations. And what really struck me about the encyclical was the way that Pope Francis was really positioning poor countries as really highly disadvantaged, and he even cites this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities and says that we need to follow this strictly, and that it's the responsibility of the polluters, the historical polluters, the rich countries, to take up most of the effort here. So he cites this, what he calls an ecological debt between the North and the South. So the idea that the North has racked up its debt by polluting so much over the past, 150 plus years, and that the South now needs to be able to have the chance to develop without having these debilitating restrictions on their emissions. Now he's definitely not promoting a dirty development pathway for these countries, but he is really focusing on the fact that if we put too many restrictions on these poorer countries, it will really, it's not fair, and it will really debilitate their ability to overcome their development challenges. So that was one thing that really struck out in the whole framing of the encyclical and the policy implications. I was also going to say one thing about paragraph 160 or 171, as Paul has already cited, so I won't read it to you guys again. But it has a lot of implications for the international climate negotiations, because it's basically a lot of people are reading into it that Pope Francis is really dismissing the idea of carbon trading markets as a solution, which is generally seen as the favorite solution of economists, and has been really favored by a lot of the countries like the EU that have been actually taking action on reducing their emissions. We've tried to implement it nationally here. It's been successfully implemented regionally in the United States. It's really what a lot, not all economists, but a lot of experts in the area push. And as you heard from Paul's reading, Pope Francis he seems to distrust this method. So the strategy of buying and selling carbon credits can lead to a new form of speculation, which would not help reduce the emissions of polluting gases worldwide. So I thought that was interesting. It does seem to reflect an overall sense of a distrust of markets and capitalism that you can read throughout the encyclical. However, I do think it's important to note that I don't think that this is a pure dismissal of market solutions. I think so. A number of analysts have pointed out that this is more of a cautionary, not a normative statement. It's not necessarily saying that we cannot have market mechanisms as a solution for climate change. I think it's more of a let's be careful in the way that we're using these, because governments can game the system. And specifically, if you look historically, the way that Pope Francis and countries such as Argentina and Peru have experienced market mechanisms, as well as the Vatican themselves. The Vatican themselves tried to do a major carbon offset initiative in Hungary, and it was highly publicized, and then it fell through, and it was quite embarrassing. So there's just a lot of ways that if they're not regulated appropriately, these market mechanisms cannot be as effective as they're espoused to be. But I don't think that it's necessarily saying that we cannot rely on these as part of the solution. That's my comment on the controversial ones.
Thanks, Emily. Sure.
So I'm going to start out on a highly specialized academic note, which is to say that I find this poem pretty awesome. So let me start with a quote. Comes from chapter 109, not 171. Some circles maintain that current economics and technology will solve all environmental problems, and argue that the problems of global hunger and poverty will be resolved simply by market growth. They show no interest in more balanced levels of production, a better distribution of wealth, concern for the environment, and the rights of future generations. Their behavior shows that far from maximizing that their behavior shows that for them, maximizing profits is enough. Yet by itself, the market cannot guarantee integral human development and social inclusion. We fail to see the deepest roots of our present failures, which have to do with the direction, goals, meaning, and social implications of technological and economic growth. This is Pope Francis. So it seems to me that Pope Francis's encyclical really accomplishes two things that we rarely find between the same covers. One, he makes a forceful argument that care for the poor and the environment is not just about Christian ethics, but rather that it represents a universal moral imperative of our time. And of course that poverty and ecosystem deterioration are also intimately related. And two, by taking a critical, and I would argue justifiably critical, look at the role of markets and rampant consumerism, as well as capitalism as a system in general, he also argues that we are not just facing an ethical crisis, but also a fundamental systemic crisis. Good ethics, or meaning to do well, being kind and generous, in short, is a necessary step in the right direction, but will never be enough. We also have to uproot the logic and imperatives of a system of exponential and mindless growth, fed in large part by endless consumption. A system in which people increasingly value only that which has a price, at the expense of care for the environment, the poor and exploited, or values such as fairness or love. The Pope offers, in short, both a unifying call for what he calls all people of goodwill, to rediscover the moral imperative of care for the poor and the environment, and a systemic critique of consumer culture and the logic of capitalism. This, to me, points to his arguably greatest contribution to current deliberations. So before we debate, as so many commentators quickly did when this encyclical came out, whether the Pope is perhaps a closet socialist or mingles in affairs he should really stay out of, or possibly just doesn't understand macroeconomics well enough, or even debates about how he fits into our larger faith traditions, I think it is important to recognize what Pope Francis has done exceptionally well, namely to raise a fundamental and fundamentally significant question. Again, in his own words, what should be direction, goals, and meaning of technological and economic growth? Rather than putting faith in the ideology of markets or profits or technology or endless consumerism or GDP growth, in short, he is inviting a much broader conversation about the purpose and direction of economic activity. A conversation not only grounded in solid ethical principles, but also built upon a more advanced understanding of the integral nature of life on a small and finite planet. And so I'm going to do something as a distinctly agnostic person that I ordinarily don't do. I'm going to stop my comments with a verse of the prayer that is at the end of the encyclical called In Union with Creation, which he says, God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your right sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out. Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk.
So my remarks sort of build on that. I too am largely pro-Pope. Pro-Pope here, although I want to be clear that I don't agree with his framing on cap and trade and economic measures. Always, as Emily rightly pointed out, it could be too much can be read into that. But I'm not going to comment on that. What I'll do is, let me start with a quote. I'm going to quote from Articles 1 and 2, not because I didn't read further, because I think it's helpful to understand how he sought to frame this at the very beginning. St. Francis of Assisi reminds us that our common home is like a sister with whom we share our life, and a beautiful mother who opens her arms to embrace us. Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us and who produces various fruits with colored flowers and herbs. This sister now cries out to us because of the harm we've inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lords and masters entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and in all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. All right. I'll come back to understand why that might be important, or why this way of framing things might matter. It's useful to step back maybe a bit and to understand the nature of the problem here. That is the nature of the political problem. Brian rightly noted that climate change is often thought of as the greatest market failure, and it is, of course, but it's also a political failure, or a failure more generally of collective action. In fact, we kind of know what to do here. I mean, it's a science issue, of course, and it's an economic issue, but the fundamental problem, in my view, is the lack of what's commonly called political will, the ability to actually act on this. And it's useful to understand why this is just so difficult. It requires, in order to solve it, collective action on an immense scale. You can think of it in different ways. One would be just in the change in our personal behaviors. So what consumption, we make. Maybe getting rid of air conditioning, I'm not sure about that. But it's also a fundamental problem of political mobilization. In order for us to solve this problem, we have to act. We have to act politically and recognize there are a lot of obstacles to political action. Emily alluded to some of them at the global level, but we could get into, if you like, the difficulties of moving legislation through the U.S. Congress. It's extremely difficult. There are a lot of entrenched forces that prevent it. And so in order for change to happen, there has to be political mobilization of some kind. And even at the level of just understanding this problem, it turns out there's a collective action problem here. They're all bound up in what might be thought of as an enormous free rider problem. So without getting into the basic game theoretic problem at work here, it is the case that it's not in my self-interest to act on this. I mean, me personally. Because, the big problems are in the future. I live in a rich country that's going to be able to adapt pretty well. I'll be gone before this is much of an issue. And in fact, the nature of this problem is such that it's incredibly difficult to get this kind of collective action, because each of us has an incentive to let others bear the cost of not being air conditioned, or driving, or abandoning our cars at the level of choice, or mobilizing for political action, going out, marching, joining, giving money to environmental groups and the like. So it is this fundamental, enormous collective action problem. And at the level of information, again, it doesn't matter whether I'm right or wrong about climate change. So I can have wrong beliefs, and it doesn't matter to me personally. Of course, collectively, it's not so good if I have wrong beliefs. But therefore, if you think of it that way, it is what's been called a super wicked problem. It's operating on timescales that are not immediate. It's hard to discern what's really happening. It's on an enormous scale. I could go on. It's also the case that there are differences between rich and poor countries. It is super difficult. So how do we solve those kinds of problems? Well, it's not easy, and there are a lot of ways that we, as human beings, try to solve them. But a fundamental one is that we tell ourselves stories about the nature of the problem that we face. Stories that engross us in a historical or environmental, or in this case, religious drama. A narrative referencing St. Francis, an image of the earth as the sister and mother being violated by humans. This is a kind of rhetorical technique that Martin Luther King uses in the Civil Rights Movement, that leaders commonly use in social movements in an effort to get people to step away from the immediate or self-interest, to imagine themselves as part of a grand historical social drama. And to see, and this is the other crucial part, is to see themselves as actors in history, to see oneself as actors in history. So Dirk used the term moral. The fundamental problem is to transform the choice of whether to act from a calculus of self-interest to a moral imperative. Or put in another language, to make it an act of identity, to make it something that one has to do in order to live with oneself, in order to be comfortable with your own story. So the rhetorical effort being made here is made in the U.S. Congress. If you look at the way he says to the members of Congress, he looks at them and says, you are part of you are actors in history. The choices you make here will determine it. So what he's trying to do is locate them, in this case, in the context of American history, to get them to step out of the immediate and to see themselves in that way. The effort, anyway, here is to align the personal self-narrative, the thing that gives us meaning in life, that with the historical, and in this case, religious narrative. Will it work? Is it effective? Well, that's another question, and a complicated one, because, of course, there are competing narratives. He's socialist, he's a communist. There are other narratives out there that are available to people, and this language may or may not resonate with all people. But notwithstanding, I have many quibbles with the particulars of the speech, including the treatment of economic incentives. But it does seem to me that the reason the Pope is important is that he's one voice, and an important voice, that is seeking to cast this issue in moral terms. Because if we don't, because it's not solvable unless we act in an altruistic way, if we act in a moral way. Because if all we do is act in self-interested ways, we're not going to solve this problem.
Thanks, and thanks to everybody. Those are really thought-provoking comments, starting with the dog walking on the legs. I want to open the floor to questions now, if that's okay. I know there's a lot of you here who have strong views on this, or just sort of interested in discussing this. So rather than having it be sort of a sermon, let's have it be sort of an exchange. So questions, thoughts, comments? Yes, and if you don't mind identifying yourself.
Yeah, I'm Luke Brotherton. I teach here at the division.
Okay.
It's a question for Paul as a background piece, because I found as I was reading it, the use of the term integralism, and we have this strong sense of ecological integralism, and I know that builds on a particular tradition, but I was kind of wrestling with what it meant in the context of this? Because it seems to be a kind of key term in the encyclical as a whole, as a kind of organising framework. And I just wonder if you could just say a little bit about what is meant by that term, how it should be understood.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've got a complicated history. I think it is the phrase integral ecology, which takes up the whole fourth section from sections 85 onwards, is the heart of it, I think. And it has political roots in Europe, which are maybe too complicated to go into, but I'd like to do two things with it. One is to say that obviously it's the book that holds together all these various different aspects of the problems that he's talking about. The problem of the poor, the problem of the degradation of the physical environment, the problem of species extinction, the problem of rampant consumerism. The idea that these can be integrated into a single problem, or rather seen as manifestations of a single set of attitudes, is what the integral label, that's part of the work that it does. The other aspect that we didn't comment on that's directly related to this is there's now a long tradition in Catholic social teaching, going back to at least Paul VI, that Francis explicitly quotes here. He quotes his predecessor, Benedict XVI, in turn quoting Paul VI, on this is in section 175, on the need for a global political authority. That if you don't have a global political authority, things like this are in fact not soluble, even if we have the conversion of heart and the moral vision that he's here advocating. And that's another aspect of the integralism thing, that you have a widening of scope with respect to political authority. So that's a key part of it. As he depicts it in those sections in the 170s, the issue is that on the one hand, the only transnationals we've got are corporations, and they have one purpose, and that is profit maximization. On the other hand, the centralization of political authority in localized nation states exactly works against the possibility of solving these problems, and that's the point you were looking at. So if you put those together, what you need is an actual transnational, and that's another meaning of the integralism thing. So you bring that all together. Now, this is another part of the encyclical that most American commentators really don't like. I mean, the idea of world political authorities tends to give at least more conservative American Catholics shivers. But I think it's deep in European Catholicism, and the tradition is shown exactly by the quotation Francis gives it, Benedict quoting Paul on this. So that's a key part of it, I think.
Jonas.
So Jonas Manos with the Nicholas Institute. So when Dave and I were brainstorming, putting together something that became this panel, one of the questions we were thinking about is what are the real implications of this, right? I mean, there's a moment in time where this has gotten a lot of attention when it came out, another moment in time that it got a lot of attention when Pope Francis was here. But so I'm somebody who's read this encyclical, but haven't read others because it didn't feel as relevant to the things that I'm interested in. So I'm curious what the implications of past encyclicals have been, and how you even measure that, and then thinking about what the implications, maybe teeing off of that, the implications for the international climate negotiations, and Fritz, maybe to you, the way that this a religious statement that challenges the political narrative, how that's been treated, not with this encyclical, but in the past, because you certainly have seen the presidential candidates who identify as Catholic dismiss this, right? I mean, this is politics. This is not something the Pope should be invested in, but maybe putting this in a historical narrative context too.
Go ahead. You want to take it?
Well, I'll just say a couple of brief things. I mean, assessing whether encyclicals work is a tricky thing, right? What they're supposed to do for Catholics is to provide, well, let me make a distinction. Formally speaking, in terms of Catholic doctrine, a letter like this is authoritative only with respect to matters of faith and morals. It doesn't bear authority with respect to particular policy recommendations or synthetic statements about the state of scientific investigation. That's not to say that what the Pope has to say about this is irrelevant to Catholics, it's just that it doesn't carry the authority of the teaching church. What does is the enunciation of principle, whether it's principle of morals or faith. So there are quite a few of those in here, though. And so the idea then is that the document of this sort of the Catholics provides a point of refuge and conversation that can't be negotiated away. It enters into the conversation in a way that it won't go away. Whether that actually, assessing what that then actually does, do people change how they live? That's, of course, another matter altogether. If one looks at previous examples, I don't know, Pacham in Terrace was quoted, the idea that what we need is peace in the world. That doesn't seem to have gone very well. So it's not clearly the case that documents like this transform public policy or even transform Catholics. What they do is provide a trajectory for further thought and discussion. His hope, clearly, is that Catholics, at least, and maybe others, will actually alter how they live. And that's, how to assess that is.
I guess building on that, I mean, I sort of, why do you think it is that the Pope really addressed in the encyclical both principles and policy? I mean, because I think people maybe as they interpret it are having a harder time with policy prescription. Why the dog walking on his hind leg?
Well, it seems commonsensical that one would, right? I mean, one can't really talk about climate change or degradation of the physical environment without actually talking about it. So to talk about it, you have to say something descriptive about it and then to make suggestions, which half a dozen places he flags them as tentative. This is not, the church has no authority on these matters. So I think some of that has to be done. One can't offer a discussion like this without doing it. But clearly, those things are not on the same level as the principle thing. It's certainly true that American commentators immediately focus on the political flavor as they perceive it on particular policy recommendations. It's not too hard to think about. If we're all actually supposed to be grateful for our very physical existence and to live modestly because of that, we're not going to listen to that because nobody wants to do that. So that's the problem, right? But there has to be some particulars as well.
I'll do maybe the U.S. and then we talk about the international. Agreed, it's very difficult to know what the impact of an encyclical, a speech at Congress, at the UN, etc. Just a couple of observations, though. One is, certainly helped to put the issue on the agenda. Got a lot of attention, a lot of focus, and that's not nothing. And it's useful to recognize the timing of this because not accidental. That there's an effort to build momentum in the leading up to the Paris summit. It's an effort to kind of recapture the lost momentum that was lost in 2009. The Obama administration has been very aggressive in the use of the Clean Air Act, as you well know, et cetera. So that it's all part of an effort to kind of revitalize the politics of this. Of course, the commentators and the Republican candidates are rejected immediately. That fine, but I think it's very hard to know what the sort of less attentive public is how they're responding to it. I haven't seen any poll evidence, but my suspicion is that it probably has some impact. Like all of it has some impact on those people to whom this rhetoric and this way of thinking is appealing, and I would think some impact with the Catholics in particular. The ultimate impact of this, though, or the sustainability of one-time speech or an encyclical makes news, it easily recedes again. And the question ultimately is whether you can take that fairly temporary political mobilization, the attention it's getting, the fact that in the moment people may be captured or moved by it. I mean, you saw John Boehner cry. Oh, wait a minute, he cries for everything. But there is a sense in which it is in the moment captivating. And always the challenge in politics is to translate that into institutions, into law, frankly, into cap and trade, right? I mean, into moral policies at the end of the day, because you can't sustain that. My guess is it's had some helpful effect for those of us who think we ought to be doing something. it's part of a larger campaign, it involves lots of actors. I don't, it's rhetoric that works for some people or framings that work for some people and not for others. I have no idea how big that impact is, but I think it was, if I'm sitting in the Obama administration, were they happy that this happened? Yeah.
So I agree with what both of you have said. I do think that we can't expect everything to change because of this one document being released, especially in the global climate change negotiations. There's a lot of different interests going on there, and a lot of the same ways narratives have been coming out from different countries over the past couple decades. I do think that there's some potential here. Well, first of all, the head of the Secretariat for the Climate Negotiations, Christiana Figueres, came out to say that she thinks that this encyclical would likely have a major impact on negotiations. I don't know if I would agree with that necessarily, but I do think it has the potential to bolster some of the framing that a lot of countries, specifically Bolivia, Venezuela, are using to really try to get this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities squarely back into the text that we come out with in December. So I think that this gives them a lot of good narrative and good frames to try to turn the discussion more on the side of morals and really playing that moral card a lot in the different discussions and the statements that we receive from these countries. Obviously, in terms of people that should be listening to this and should be responding to this, we would expect this encyclical to maybe resonate more with Catholic countries. I don't think that'll have too much of an impact because most of the countries that are really Catholic in the world are kind of on board with taking action on climate change. A lot of the Latin American countries, a lot of the European countries that are highly Catholic are kind of already heading in that direction. So I'm not quite sure if we can make a direct connection there. But I do think that a lot of his ideas are about starting this new non-Western, non-consumerist type of development. So instead of saying developing countries, poor countries, you need to become the United States. And like China, you're going to become as coal dependent as the US is. Instead, looking at these poorer countries that are still on the verge of development and still have their pathway to development open and not set, I think we could see more of a reliance on renewable energies and more sustainable type developments coming out of some of the narrative from this encyclical. Specifically, he talks a lot about the importance of technology transfer, which has been an important part of the negotiations, but I could see it becoming a bigger part because the idea that these developing countries, these poor countries, in order to develop cleanly, they need technologies from the richer countries. They need renewable energy technologies and things like that. And so I could definitely see this encyclical motivating the discussions on technology transfers in the negotiations to a higher position on the agenda as a really important part of how we're thinking about the dynamics between developed and developing countries.
Let me just add a couple of thoughts. I mean, as an historian, I would say that obviously it's too early to tell whether this is going to have any impact, but it seems to me that it has the potential to have a lot of impact. Right? And so, one way to, there are obviously lots of ways to think about this, but one of the ways to think about it is in terms of, the environmental movements around the world. This is providing a frame and a context for them to think about and to organize. And I have talked to a lot of people who seem to think that this also brings in more people into the movement. It seems to me that one of the ways to think about it too is to think about it in terms of power. And when you think about concentrated power around the world, there are lots of different ways, loci, that we could identify. Multinational corporations, governments, and so on, but the Catholic Church is certainly one. And it seems to me that this is the first time that a large institution that has a lot of power has put climate change and this type of change front and center on the agenda. And I can't think of anybody else who's done that. And it seems to me, you know, this raises all sorts of interesting questions as to where this type of change will actually originate. And so Obama, obviously, as you all know, has had a lot of difficulties getting this on the agenda and getting anything passed. So, you know, there's a distinct possibility for small d Democrats in the room, a really troubling possibility that some of the more innovative things are coming out of places like China and the Vatican. Not exactly known for the, you know, small d democracy. But so I think that's important because I think this can also change how institutions think about this phenomenon and this problem. And I think it puts it into the limelight of attention in ways that could have interesting consequences.
Did you had your hand up before? And then I'd like to see some questions from the back.
Sure.
Young people.
Are you calling on me?
I'm calling on you, then I'm warning them. I may call on one.
Well, I put my hand back down because I have too many questions. But well, let me just highlight a couple of things and then pose a question. One is, I think the encyclical is especially important as not only a call to action on climate change and for moral as well as for reasons of personal morality as well as addressing inequality, but also because over the course of, or over the history of the what you might think of as understandings of the human relationship to nature, there at least was a long period in which Catholic or biblical doctrine was associated more with the dominion story in Genesis, and the shift to St. Francis of Assisi, as you quoted, and the shift to maybe, I'm not sure if that's what creation matters refers to, but the shift to Christianity and Catholicism in particular, taking seriously conservation or stewardship or something along those lines. I'm not sure how actually exactly it would be articulated. That could be important on very long time scale, as well as this year, perhaps more than this particular year. The second thing I wanted to highlight is a couple of key phrases. One is common but differentiated responsibility, as Emily pointed out. You know, I think that phrase was always meant in the climate change treaties to start with the word common responsibility, as well as differentiated. So even in the Framework Convention in 1992, all parties were committing to take policies and measures to reduce greenhouse gases. It's true that then industrialized countries had additional responsibilities, but the differentiation was not meant to say that low-income countries have zero responsibility. And now, as you mentioned, countries that were low-income in 1992 have become much wealthier and much larger emitters, to the point that China used to emit half as much as the United States. Now it's the opposite. The United States emits about half as much as China. China's per capita emissions are now about equal to Europe's per capita emissions. At the same time, per capita incomes in China are still lower, but in several other countries, South Korea, Mexico, and others, per capita incomes have grown rapidly. So that's one. Agreeing with Emily, it's a much more complicated world context of income and emissions than it was perhaps in 1992. And the other phrase is the Pope's Article 171 on criticizing carbon credits. And there I think it's also helpful to I think that is not necessarily a criticism of cap and trade. It's important to see the distinction between carbon credits in the sense of offset credits obtained in countries that do not have caps, in contrast to a more formal system of cap and trade, because those uncapped offset credits have gotten a lot of criticism from economists and and legal experts and others, including me, suggesting that those are not a reliable way of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, because you're not sure whether the reduction at one project site might be countered by increases at other in other parts of the economy of that country. So it is, I think, a plausible interpretation of Article 171 that it's criticizing these uncapped offset credit markets rather than criticizing all cap and trade markets. There's more to say about that, about the possible design of cap and trade markets actually to redress inequality, to assist low-income countries. And so that also is in contrast to what Article 171 says. Okay, all that, here's my question to the panel. You can comment on any of that, but the question is about, to further this question about what's the follow-up, as Jonas asked, and the effectiveness, which is really a question about time. That is, if climate change is a long, distant future problem, then maybe we have time to construct a global political system, world government, or to change the moral beliefs of billions of people around the world. But if climate change is more pressing in time, then we may need changes in incentives right now that take people as they are without trying to change moral attitudes or human nature over the course of centuries. But maybe there's an opportunity to make that change happen more quickly. So I'm interested in what the implementation strategy would be. Does the Pope instruct the bishops to then instruct the priests to proselytize this message around the world, or are there other approaches that would? In what way does Cristina Figueres think that it will have an impact in December? So versus or simultaneously trying to design policy and institutional changes that have a much more near-term impact.
So just I could comment on all of those things, but on the last point.
Just so you know, we got 5 minutes left.
All right, I'll be very quick.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know that. That's okay.
So what I'm not arguing for is a long-term plan to change everyone's moral beliefs and then to have voluntary collective action in perpetuity. What in fact I'm arguing is that there's an incredible urgency in the situation, and that the vehicle for mobilizing political pressure to put in place policies that alter people's incentives requires this kind of thing. So, I mean, back to this, I don't see the two things in tension. I mean, we can design all the policies we want, but unless we get them through the U.S. Congress and we get them negotiated at the global level, et cetera, it's not going to happen. And that was my point, is that fundamentally this is a political problem. So, yes, I mean, change people's beliefs over a long period of time. I think what's really trying to happen is to frame it in a way that appeals to people's current beliefs, in a sense, the stock of narratives and religious beliefs, etc., in the moment, to try to get some movement on this. So that's my own sense of timing. In fact, not that we're trying, hoping that in 50 years everyone will just do the right thing voluntarily. I think maybe that's will happen, but I think the real urgency is to get enough political energy to get the kind of political will it takes to put policies in place that will alter people's incentives, and we'll have a real bite on this problem. Might be comment on other things, but I'll leave it there.
I think before we move to it, I really do want to see. So I see a couple of hands in the back of the room. I'd like to.
Sure.
I see you at the very back of the room.
Great, thanks. I'm Wills Rooney. I'm an undergraduate senior, and my question pertains to what Francis' encyclical adds to the ethical nature of our conversation about environmentalism, with particular respect to kind of ecology of culture, of society, ecology of the family he speaks about. I think we all noticed when he was here in the United States, he very much transcends politics. We try to put a binary American lens on him, and he certainly does not fit into that. And I thought one of the interesting things that comes up in the encyclical is, at times, it's not emphasized hugely, but it's certainly throughout, interwoven into every aspect of Catholic social thought, is a certain ecology of the family and an ecology of human beings' relation to each other. That implies a certain formal and final cause of what the family looks like, how life should be preserved, and these things, in my view, seem to run very much in contradiction to some dimensions or strains of environmentalism, which advocate for population control, or other ways of combating. Combating or confronting issues pertaining to just human, volume of human life. And so I was wondering what he might add to the conversation, how this moral vision might be received by the broader international environmentalist community.
Meaning the fact that it's sort of a message that is bundled with other Catholic messages about things like birth control that might seem to run
precisely. Yeah, birth control, abortion, same-sex marriage. These things all, I think, are play into at least a Catholic lens of environmental care.
Anybody want to take that one on?
Oh, well, yeah, sure. I mean, I think we are losing something in our discussion of the encyclical. It's probably what Will's just pointed to. It's very easy, natural to us, to move to the level of thinking about what we need to do in terms of policy in the short term, and that certainly is urgent. There are pressing matters. But the encyclical actually, I don't think, is most fundamentally about that. The encyclical is trying to present a vision all out and all the way down, from abortion to global climate change, of what it would be like to think in a certain way. That's what the encyclical is most fundamentally doing. And we may or may not like all of it, but in terms of the way this document works, all these bits hang together. And so to jettison one part or another in light of our interest in policy questions about climate change isn't adequate to the encyclical. It may be adequate to other purposes, it may be essential to other purposes. So I think it's important just to keep that in mind. There's another piece of it that I think is also important. I don't know what people who know more about policy than I think about this, but the Pope clearly thinks that if we're to respond seriously to environmental degradation and climate change, this actually means, in the short term, a serious change in style of life, especially for rich people, meaning us, essentially. And that's one of the reasons exactly why the policy recommendations are not going to go anywhere, because rich people actually don't want to change their style of life. And so that's an important topic too. There's on the ground, there's suggestions here about things we ought to do differently. So that's difficult, I think. It's difficult to see what's going to happen about that.
We'll take on one more.
We're just at time, but yeah, let's take one more question. And then remember, there's donuts and coffee outside, and nobody's going to scatter immediately.
Okay,
so we can continue the conversation, but after you get coffee. So one more.
I see faith-based advocacy groups like filling the gap between, this faith-based environmental ethic and the Pope is advocating for and the policy. How effective do you think these faith-based advocacy groups are on the national, in the US, and the international sphere? And do you see them bring about any positive changes? Or are they just kind of reinforcing the politicized nature of climate change?
Well, faith-based groups, but not just the Catholic Church, but say, for example, the Methodist Church, very active in this space, and as are many other groups. In fact, and as Jonathan was pointing out, one of the things that's going on here is effort to shift the focus from the dominion to the stewardship parts of the biblical tradition, which are available. You could see what you want and pick what you want in some sense out of the Christian Bible, but they're sort of available narratives or available traditions. Historically, religious groups have been important in all manner of social justice movements in the U.S. I don't know how to quantify that, but I do think it's helpful. It is complicated, but previous questions, excellent one. They're a lot. From a political standpoint, my interest is what parts of this get picked up or don't get picked up, and so you're quite right. And so there are lots of inconvenient parts of this for people like myself in this, and so I'm going to pick up what I want to, and so too will other groups out there. So it's a little hard to know exactly what parts of it will resonate with whom. But I think they're historically and currently an important part of the landscape.
Can we take one more? Okay, sure, one more, and then John, you get to ask.
Sorts of rights. I don't know.
You speak up a little.
I don't know. So, you talked about how the role of government is, how the Pope was trying to talk to the Obama administration, the congressman, and I feel that that is important. But there are also lobbyists and corporations that play huge influences to this whole climate change issue. What do you think about that? How will they be influenced by the Pope's message?
Well, the lobbyists won't be much influenced by the Pope's message, and they're still there, and they're still super important. So you shouldn't, nor should we delude ourselves to think that in that moment when everyone's applauding and he's got the focus of the members of Congress, and in that moment they're sort of with him, but that will hold for very long once they're back out and they realize they're running for election, and the lobbyists suggest how much money they donated to the campaign and that kind of thing. So, I mean, that's part of the problem that I was alluding to, and part of why the virtue of these kinds of frames is, Dirk was saying, is they provide a language to help organize around, for religious groups in this case, but also for non-religious. I think it sort of, inspired a lot of environmentalists. It gives energy, which is necessary if you're going to countervail that the more concentrated power of interests who are trying to prevent action. So, yeah, they're still there and important.
So I was going to wrap up with one thing, I guess, which is that the Pope, we started off with the definition of a very top-down view of what the encyclical is supposed to be. It's the Pope speaking to the bishops and the bishops speaking to the flock, and the flock is just supposed to accept that and go on. Well, what's really been cultivated here is the flock is speaking to each other, and I think that's probably also partly why the Pope reached out globally to get this message so that we could all read it and we could all talk about it. So I do want to thank you for the opportunity to let the flock get together and talk about this. And I hand it back over to you.
Well, thank you. And Jonas, too, who you pointed to in the beginning. This really wasn't me. It started with Jonas, and I just said swap about this stuff. But I want to ask all you to help us thank these guys. Around, but hopefully they will move in and help yourself with things for creation matters. But things outside for their have questions, come ask me too.